Hi, everybody. This is Steve Maggi from SMA Law Firm. Welcome to Building the Bridge. I have the honor of having with me today Andrew Hughes, who's an insurance broker with the Alliance Insurance Group. He's based in St. Petersburg, Florida. His firm works all over the US, and Andrew's worked a lot with foreign companies. So I wanted to interview you today, Andrew. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
So let's just get to the basics, which is, of course, a lot more complex than when we would hope, but that's why experts like you are so necessary. What kind of insurance does a person need if they're setting up a U.S. company, or what kind of insurance does that U.S. company that's created need?
Sure. So again, that is a much more complex answer than it is a question, but let's start at the basic building blocks.
Okay.
So if you're going to have employees in the US, you're going to need workers' compensation insurance. And that insurance in the US is basically the employee support for injured workers who get hurt on the job. And that's something that in Europe is oftentimes covered by the state, okay, or by the individual country. In the US, it's done through this insurance program. And one key thing to note is that workers' compensation is different in each one of the 50 states. So it's not the same all across the US.
There's different mandates by state in terms of minimums or kinds of coverages then? Correct. Okay.
Because each state is a separate insurance licensing entity. We don't actually have national insurance in the US, with one exception, which is the National Flood Insurance Program, which is administered, and our terrorism program.
I think you mentioned to me in our personal conversations that the United States was almost like Europe in terms of the countries of Europe being like individual states in the US, right? Every state is almost like its own country.
Correct. Especially when it comes to insurance.
Okay, so workers' compensation, we've got that. You have a physical space with employees in it. That also covers employees who work virtually, even if they're in a different state, correct?
Correct. And again, one of the things that you mentioned is if they're in a different state, you have to make sure that your insurance program will cover those employees in those states and that they're licensed in those states. Otherwise, you're picking up additional policies state by state by state to sometimes cover just one worker who's working virtually.
Right, and your job is to come up with a comprehensive plan that incorporates this and all these other factors. What other kinds of coverages do people need besides workers' comp, depending on the circumstances?
Sure. So the second cornerstone is liability insurance. We're a very litigious society in the US, so we have liability policies even just to cover, if somebody falls down and slips and falls on the floor in your office space, and protects you against that. Every single lease in the US is going to require liability insurance. Generally, they don't care about your property. That is the thing that you have to watch out for on your own. So if we're just talking about covering a small office, you can generally get a pretty inexpensive, comprehensive policy that covers your liability and your property all in one go. If you are building a facility here, then we have to take into account the property insurance. So standalone property insurance that is going to make sure that depending on where you're located, if you're in what we call high hazard zones, so anything that's coastal, anything that's subject to earthquakes, anything that's subject to frequent tornadoes, things like that, your property insurance is going to be much more expensive and your options are going to be much more limited.
Which is interesting because a lot of people only think about taxes. Right, and we've talked about this in our personal conversations working with our clients, that it's a balancing. There's so many different factors that you have to take into consideration besides going to a place like Wyoming or somewhere that's just cheaper. But what about other kinds of costs that come with it in terms of operating and the insurance part?
Correct. And it is a balancing act, and that's why having your advisors that you're working with work together to help come up with a comprehensive plan that they can say, okay, here's the cost associated with why, you give them 3 locations. It's going to be this in your insurance expense. It's going to be this in your tax savings. Oftentimes that'll make more sense if you're getting good enough tax savings to offset. But if you're not budgeting for that insurance plan, then you're in trouble. One nice thing about insurance in the US is that it is almost always a rate on percentage. So
Okay.
if you are having workers' compensation and you know that it costs you $3 in workers' compensation insurance for every $100 that you pay somebody, you can build that rate in to all of your projections. And you can also build that into your pricing for your products or your services.
Okay.
And the most successful companies that I work with are building their insurance costs into their pricing models as well. So being able to say, okay, this is how we're going to have to price our product in order to have our location here and be profitable.
Brilliant, because they see it as a tax. It's something that can be, deducted for your corporate level taxes.
Mm-hmm.
But to incorporate into your pricing model makes it also something that becomes indispensable. And that way you can do business and take a deep breath because you know that you've covered yourself. And that's really important right away. I've done presentations overseas where a litigator or a corporate lawyer has talked about what happens when you go to litigation and how that can wipe out your US operations. And so the insurance part is oftentimes overlooked.
Yes, and that's where your liability insurance really comes into play. And it's critical. As I said earlier, it's required for almost every single contract in the US and to have a certain amount of liability insurance. And so also having your broker and your other advisors review those contracts before you sign is critical. Because if you're signing at a cost X, but your insurance cost is going to triple, that might not make sense as a contract for you to move forward.
Right. Any other tips, or are there any other indispensable kinds of coverages that you recommend, or is it really just after those two that we discussed, a question of analyzing case per case,
So there's about 30 other lines of coverages available, depending on what type of operation you have. And so it becomes a balancing act. Insurance is all about a balancing act, because if we were to give you every kind of insurance that's feasible under the sun for your operation, it would be too expensive for you to operate. Okay. Just perfectly honest. Now, so what we need to do is we need to figure out whether you have HR policies in place that are going to help mitigate risks so we don't have to buy insurance for this to certain levels.
Okay.
Or what are we doing in terms of site safety and management? And this is all the risk management side of insurance, where when building out a program, we have to say, if we don't have policies and procedures in place, we either have to A, insure it, or B, you have to be comfortable with the risk to go alone and be out of pocket if the worst case scenario happens.
And so I guess the important thing here is to think about how to protect yourself, and meaning your company, its assets, and for future planning, to think long-term instead of short-term. People oftentimes think of the bottom line and what they can cut out, but they need to protect their futures in order to continue to grow, in order to get to those goals, that they want to reach, right?
Correct. And just to hammer this point home again, if you have a 3-year plan for your operations, once you're after launch in the US, share those plans with your advisor so that they can help think long-term with you, so that it can advise you on the types of growth. Okay, we're going to add a facility at this point. Here are the things that we need to consider. Here's what you want to look at in the property. It could be even here are the neighborhoods you want to look at, because we're going to get a better rate. All those types of advice can be requested from your broker or advisor,
if they're the right one. And that's the key. That's why I'm bringing my audience to you and sharing this, because we want people to work with the right people who know not only how to think long-term because they're trying to protect their clients, but also know how to work in tandem with other professionals that are part of this equation. So thank you so much for all your knowledge today. How do people get in touch with you when they have questions, when they're ready to really start thinking seriously about their US plans, or maybe even companies that are already in the US that want to grow, adapt, change? A lot of them are reinventing themselves now. How do they get in touch with you, Andrew?
Sure. Well, I'm always happy to consult. The best way to reach me is by email. It's andrew.h@allilliance.com. insgrp.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us today.